Thank you guys all for being here tonight. So I'm going to kind of just jump right into tonight's discussion. We're going to talk for like 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And the focus tonight is on the anti-Trump resistance, what feminism looks like today, and how we continue to prioritize pleasure and happiness instead of just being reactive and pissed all the time. So please think of questions to ask our awesome panelists in about half an hour. So we were just in the green room, the three of us were all talking about the day after the election and how all of us are writers and journalists, and we had all pre-written our like Hillary wins and here's what it means for feminism pieces. And having to either go back from the Javits Center where Samita was, or for me, like sit on my couch all day fighting tears to rewrite every single one of these things that we had spent so many hours of our time drafting. So I'm curious to sort of get us started. What's different now in the feminist landscape in terms of both our kind of immediate goals and our long-term vision than it was the first week of November?
Well, so I was working at Fusion in the wee hours of the morning during the election, and I hadn't actually written anything about Hillary, but I had something drafted about how Texas might go either blue or purple, which was total wishful thinking and propelled by an argument that there had been a lot of effective reproductive rights activism there after, Wendy Davis's last stand and all of the and the Supreme Court decision and everything. And instead, I ended up writing this piece with the headline that was something like "Never underestimate how much America hates women." And of course, it was written in a fever dream at midnight, but that's basically what my wake-up call has been ever since. That I thought, just like everybody else, that these kinds of sexist remarks that seem kind of relatively innocent compared to policy are inextricably connected, and the people in power now feel emboldened to not even hide their sexism or contempt for women. And that's like basically what's changed for me. I was thinking that feminism was going more mainstream, and that might be true if you are the type of person to read certain publications on the internet, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still not mainstream. It's still not in sort of our lifeblood in the way that we're the way that we thought after Beyonce put the word feminist on the stage and all those big pop culture moments. And that was sort of reinforced for me actually when I spent a month in Texas last month, and I talked to a bunch of different young people who are saying that they, when they go on the internet, that's sort of a portal where feminism is mainstream and feminism is accepted, and there's sort of a baseline, but people who they hang out with every day don't feel the same way. So for me, it was a wake-up call to get out of my internet bubble.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't okay, so prior to the election, I am an editorial director at this millennial news platform called Mike, and so I had been really working around the clock and hadn't fully emotionally kind of processed what was at stake outside of debating several young Bernie supporters in my office constantly until I was red in the face. And so the night that it happened, I was at the Javits Center, and as Jill said, I had this 2,000 word piece that it took me 3 days, and I was crying to write, and I was so excited to publish it, and kind of realizing at Javits the moment that I had to go back to the office because we had to rewrite everything because Trump was going to be president. And so for several hours I was just in shock. I couldn't process because we had to work. And then the next day I just totally lost it. I mean, there's video of me on the internet crying about what was lost that night. That my company thought would be a good idea to put on Facebook. But apparently one of the young writers in the office came up to me a couple of weeks ago, and she was like, Samita, the day after the election, you walked into the office and you said, everything I've worked for was meaningless. And I was like, oh my God, I felt so bad that I said it. But it's you know, not only have I kind of been doing gender work for a long time, it's like I have a bachelor's in feminism and a master's in feminism, and like used to run a website called Feministing, and it just felt like so much of what I had worked for so many years kind of I had started to almost think was making a difference and making progress and making change, and had like kind of almost taken it for granted, because I was like, oh, we're in this like post-gender landscape where young women, like they don't even relate to Hillary. They want like Laverne Cox to be president. And that's like so exciting. And, you know, and kind of thinking like it was so taken for granted, and having that moment that like we could live in a culture that has lemonade, like, you know, Beyonce's Lemonade, at the same time that like we can't get a woman in the White House. And that kind of confounded contradiction was just so mind-numbing for me. And I feel like, you know, very much to kind of your book and what, you know, we're talking a lot about in terms of self-care, like I've really turned inward in the last couple of months, because so much of my work has been public, in terms of thinking about like what does it actually look like to rethink what the left could look like, and what a progressive movement actually looks like, and what are the conversations we need to have, because there's a lot of them.
So what are some of them? I mean, feminism, when I was writing the book that I hope all of you buy and review positively on Amazon, when I was writing it with this assumption that Hillary Clinton, we're moving forward. We're going to have probably Hillary Clinton, or at least some Democrat, as president. And we can get to things like paid parental leave. Like that's just going to be a thing we get in the next 4 years. And the question is what that looks like and how much time women and men get, and you know, it's sort of moving around the contours of these more feminist policies, and now we've hit this massive roadblock. So other than just kind of having up a defensive wall, which obviously is a lot of the work that we're all doing right now, what should the feminist movement's goals be? What's kind of both our big picture and then our kind of like micro level where we can actually move forward in such a hostile environment?
I have one answer to this. It's a huge question, but one thing I've been thinking about while I actually have been watching The Handmaid's Tale, which of course was written in the Reagan era, which is in the 80s, the open misogyny and conservatism was incredibly linked to the religious right and the rise of evangelical Christianity. And actually, when we were all coming up in the Bush years, the same thing was true. And now we have a situation where it's not necessarily true. I mean, Mike Pence is one of those evangelical Christians who's sort of more traditionally putting the rights of reproductive rights in the name of God. But Trump certainly isn't, and his supporters certainly aren't. And that actually makes it a lot more difficult in some ways, because you can't make any blanket statements about what somebody might think about women's rights just because they're secular or they don't speak in terms of God. That still doesn't mean that they're going to support abortion rights or support paid family leave or anything like that. But it does actually, it's in some ways a relief to me, because it makes misogyny so much more obvious when there's no God to hide behind. And I think that's like what made me a little bit relieved about Trump and what I thought would cause him to lose the election, because he wasn't hiding his misogyny behind an ideology, he just was sexist. But now that it's clear that that doesn't matter to everybody, even women, I think we have to sort of reframe who our enemies are. And in some ways that's getting harder, and in some ways that's getting easier, but I don't think it's as simple as like, you know, conservative evangelical Christians are bad and that's it, you know? So that's one thing I've been thinking about.
Would you like me to share my 10-point platform?
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
10-point plan for feminist victory.
I mean, look, I work in words. I feel like there's so many different levels that this needs to happen, right? And there's kind of like the legislative and electoral strategy. the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is this contradiction between how much progress we've kind of made publicly and in pop culture with feminism versus how much progress we haven't made legislatively, and kind of how do we take these like really effective cultural strategies that are engaging people in numbers that we could not have even imagined even 10 years ago when we started writing, to actually drive interest in the legislative process and voter engagement and voter outreach. And that I don't have an answer for that, but I'm really interested in that connection. I mean, I am not one of those people that's like, this has been great for the left. It's like, no, this is terrible. But, there is a moment right now where people are kind of having a moment in terms of like, what are their politics? What do they stand for? What's, are they going to get off their asses and go do something? And we're seeing that they are. And what's been most remarkable to me is of all of the kind of isms that were agitated through the campaign, it was really under the banner of feminism and sexism that drove millions of women out around the world. Which is both exciting, but then of course has like shortcomings in terms of, at what point are we going to, as kind of a mainstream feminist movement, acknowledge and truly incorporate difference in a way that, people feel kind of heard and is effective and global, but then is also like has a streamlined agenda. Because I think when you incorporate everything, and I know there's like some really vibrant conversations right now about like, what are the lines of feminism? Can you be a Zionist and feminist? Can you be, anti-prisons and feminist and all of this stuff, and or like pro fight for 15, and everyone kind of falls in different lines. And I think when you're building a movement, like there are some negotiations you actually have to make and difficult conversations. And so I think for feminism, we kind of have to do that. But then I think more broadly for the left, this like crazy war on identity politics, it's like we need to just cut that, like, and fight back about like what makes the left good is incorporating difference and centralizing and prioritizing the most disenfranchised voices. And that's a conversation I feel like that we can do culturally. That's like a cultural conversation that we can actually control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the identity politics debates have certainly been roiling the left over the past couple months. I mean, I can probably...
What do you think?
About identity politics?
No, I mean about like what we need to prioritize in feminism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I guess to me, what I think we should be doing, obviously, is you need to be a bulwark against the sort of terrible encroachments that we're already seeing, going to continue to see. But to me, the kind of biggest task, and often the hardest task, is maintaining a really clear and coherent moral vision as an alternate to what Trump is offering. And, I think it's very easy to get sort of caught up in the day-to-day of, today we're banning refugees, and tomorrow we're wiping out your health care, and the day after that we're cutting off women's health care around the world. So, I mean, there's so much going on that I think it's quite, at least for me, I get stuck on my, like, news rabbit hole where I feel like it's just activist and writer whack-a-mole all the time. And not always putting forth a view that says, okay, here's what Trump's doing, and we not all of us obviously, but most of us in this room, I would assume, agree that it's not the best. But here's what we would offer you. Here's the alternate feminist vision for what our world and our country and our laws and policies look like. And that can be a really hard thing to do when you're totally on the defensive. But I think kind of keeping that as the backdrop to feminist activism is important. So I guess on that, I'd be curious to hear from both of you what you think the big feminist vision is. What's the backdrop to what we're doing?
Shel.
I know. I didn't prep you guys for this one, sorry.
The big feminist vision. I mean, well, I think so the piece around identity politics to me is one of the things that's really frightening to me about this move away from identity politics is people not, you can kind of have all your criticisms of Hillary Clinton and like what that meant for feminism, and that's not my feminism and blah, blah, blah. But it's also like discounting the role that sexism actually did play in her election. And I worry that, our desire to build a more broad-based progressive movement that distances ourselves from identity politics risks missing that really important data point from the election, that, is kind of like, well, it wasn't sexism. It's like because she's like untrustworthy, and you're like, wait, what? Like, wait, but that's kind of part of that. So, in terms of like, I feel like I don't have an answer for like what the big vision for feminism is, but I think that we really need to hold people's feet to the fire around the fact that like sexism is still such a current and real problem and impacts like every part of how we're interacting with like political, cultural, and like social systems. And like if there is an opportunity or a way to kind of like actually talk about that in a way that's kind of inclusive and doesn't just feel like Ivanka Trump feminism.
I'm reading her book right now.
Yeah. That's exciting to me, but yeah. I mean, not that you're reading
Not
it,
that.
but like.
I get glared at on the subway a lot.
Well, caveat that because I got asked to be on this panel today, I haven't had a chance to read your book, Jill. But
That came out 2 days ago and it's
I know.
800 pages long.
But I actually wanted to draw attention to what I think is the central question, which is, not just being on the defensive, but actually structuring feminism in terms of happiness and pleasure. And that's actually something that I have grown up with. My mother was a radical feminist writer. Her name is Nona Willis, and she was always advocating for pleasure politics and advocating to not be on the defensive and to center the idea of pleasure in feminist politics, even when you're talking about people who need baseline rights, which is, I think, the argument against what, like, the infighting, like when the infighting happens, it's, well, how can you be talking about pleasure when there's women who are, like, their access to reproductive health care are getting cut off and they can't afford to feed their kids and they have all these really, really baseline problems. But it's really not a zero-sum game, because the whole reason why people are trying to control women's bodies and not allowing them to be full participants in the economy and things like that is because kind of the morality of sacrifice and not realizing the potential of the political power of like a fully satisfying and pleasurable life. So that's very broad, but I think that any successful feminist platform will have that element, and I've actually seen that. I think even 10 years ago, feminism was a little bit more, I don't know, maybe more like 15 years ago, but they were a little bit like more hesitant to engage with pop culture and engage with, fun, sexy things. And I think it's all really connected and really important.
So one thing that has come up a lot in the aftermath of this election that I hear a lot of women talking about is this idea of self-care. And like I said, I'm reading Ivanka Trump's book right now, and there's this part in there where she talks about being...
Doesn't sound like self-care, Jill.
Right. That is not part of my self-care routine. But there's this part in there where she's talking about how in the like really stressful parts of the election, she didn't even have time to get a massage. And like, can you imagine? And self-care, there's been a couple of really great, there's a New Yorker article on this, sort of started out the concept of it as a pretty radical idea that was really pushed, especially by African-American feminists. This idea that in a society that does not value your body and your labor and your existence, that there is something really radical about claiming that space for yourself and saying, I'm going to take care of this. And now we see self-care being about like, go to a SoulCycle class and like treat yourself to a chocolate bar and buy this thing and get, your rainbow bubble bath and Instagram it. And it seems to have gotten quite depoliticized. So, I mean, what is the role of pleasure and caring for oneself within a feminist movement, but also in the broader Trump resistance? And how do we do that in a way that feels effective and true to ourselves without kind of partaking in this, kind of like Gwyneth Paltrow-ized goop culture?
Well, I think it starts by acknowledging that self-care as we've determined it nowadays is just automatically gendered. Like retail therapy, I looked into this actually this was before the election, but I had this family crisis that had like unwittingly made me like one of those self-care people where I was like going on shopping sprees and like not understanding why, and then realizing it was for self-care reasons. But I was like having to be a caretaker for my father, and then I sort of swapped that gendered role to like another gendered role, which was disturbing to me. And I sort of realized the politics of self-care there, that if you are interpreting it in this sort of consumerist way that you were just talking about, that you are sort of participating in like a statistically gendered behavior. If that does make you feel good, that is totally valid. It made me feel good to buy like a $500, DVF dress, but it still was like a gendered behavior in a way that like men are not encouraged to do those sort of things. So I think, you have to do stuff that genuinely, intuitively makes you feel like you're doing something for yourself, but you still have to put it in context of the expectations on you versus everybody else.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot. After the election, I kind of had this moment where I felt like looked at the last 20 years of my life and I was like, oh my God, I have worked tirelessly and now we have to keep going. And I just like didn't know, like I was like, where is this energy going to come from? I have no idea where it's going to come from. And it's kind of forced me to really think about how to take care of yourself within the context of a very capitalist society that, as you say, like beyond the fact that you have to like self-care is commodified right now. It's like there are no boundaries in our workplaces, right? Like you don't have like it's like people are constantly afraid they're going to lose their job, so they feel like they have to work around the clock, and they, you have all these like pressures around just like there isn't like no one's going to take care of you, and you have to take care of yourself, and that's like especially true as young women in the workforce, and so I think that what's exciting to me about this both is like conversations that people are having around boundaries with the workplace, right? And having like really honest conversations about like what does it look like to just be like, no, I'm not going to do that, or making time for yourself. But I also will say like a lot of the Black Lives Matter activists talk about self-care, which has been really exciting to me because I haven't seen activists publicly really talk about that in a very long time, and specifically mental health care, and kind of something I talk to a lot of. Like we have a reporting team on the movement for Black Lives, and there are young Black reporters that have to report every single day on police killings, and there's a psychological trauma to that. And making space in the newsroom to have that conversation and say like, if you need the day off, take the day off.
I remember there was like some Medium post that was like Black Personal Day or whatever.
Right.
I forget what the term was,
Yeah.
but it was like, I'm a Black person, I need to take a personal
Yeah.
day. Like when there was a police shooting or something.
Yeah. Or even like a lot of my writers have told me that like even the fact that I say that makes them feel like they have permission, and then they kind of like don't need it because they're like, oh, like that means like it's allowed in this workplace for me to like have this emotion but then like get back to work. And so I think it's like I actually think what I'm seeing is young people are engaging with it in a way that like my generation may not have. And because we just were like, we're going to work until we like get to the top, and then it's like, then we die. And so I think it's very important, but like I'm also seeing it kind of being incorporated in all different kinds of spaces, which is exciting.
Yeah. So even looking around the room, and obviously this panel, it's a lot of women showing up, which has kind of been, it seems like, a mark of the anti-Trump resistance. You had the Women's March, which was massive. Even the lawyers that were showing up at the airports to help refugees file for asylum. I mean, that was a lot of young women with their laptops writing briefs. It seems kind of at every level of this, from the senators who have been very vocal and congresswomen who have been quite vocal, a lot of women who are leading the resistance, which obviously intuitively feels like a strength. Like maybe now our voices and our issues will get heard. But I mean, do you think that's going to be the case, that we, in leading the resistance, or at least being at the forefront of it, that our issues are going to take priority? Or is this kind of one of those other examples of invisible female labor? I guess this one isn't invisible, but not necessarily recognized or paid back, that men will ultimately reap more benefits from.
I mean, I don't know, Jill. Why is Nancy Pelosi out here talking about maybe choice isn't central to the Democratic platform? I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't. I worry, at least. Mm-hmm. I worry. And I don't, like, if you look at kind of like radical movements throughout history, women have actually always been on the front lines, especially in emerging nations and like other countries, like the front lines of the revolution have always been women, and often when like new nation states emerge, people will be like the men will be like, okay, well, we just like need to get everything organized first, and then like we'll let women go to college, you know, and like it kind of never happens. And you know, I worry that something similar is happening right now, along with, you know, Democrats, capital D, resistance and reluctance to kind of embrace identity politics and kind of some of our bigger lessons from the election, that they will start playing politics with women's rights, and like they won't kind of prioritize that stuff, and they may make lip service to it, but it's not actually going to be part of the agenda. That is my fear, but maybe I'm being negative.
Well, I think that's definitely true on the like congressional, like the political, the hard politics side, but on the grassroots side, I'm actually pretty optimistic, partly because I believe that there's been some sort of shift in the last few years of just like not dumping all of this like glamour and responsibility onto a few figureheads and a few leaders and a few icons. Like the last few major social movements run by the left, like, and young people have been vehemently against that model, which like in some ways has diminished their effectiveness, but in other ways really gives me hope, because that's historically how women get sidelined. That's historically how people of color get sidelined in the feminist movements. And it does seem to be sort of a more collectivist vibe in the last few years, like starting with Occupy and all of the and Black Lives Matter is very non-hierarchical, and it just like does make me feel like something is shifting a little bit, because I mean, like compared to the 60s movements, for instance, and the feminist movements, like there were a few people who like got all of the credit, and then there were like a bunch of people in the background doing some of the work, and it doesn't really seem to be the case nowadays.
I mean, do you think that there are downsides to that? Is that kind of lack of hierarchy within a very hierarchical society and political universe, in at least the immediate term, a handicap?
For sure, yeah. And I definitely have thought that it's a handicap. First of all, it's not really translating to electoral politics in the same way that, say, the Tea Party did. They basically funneled all of their most prominent activists and people who were just being opportunist, and got a lot of things done and did a lot of damage and were very obstructionist, in kind of an admirable way, I have to say. Like, I know people are super frustrated on like quote unquote our side about them being obstructionist, but I really wish the Democrats would be doing that, and they haven't been. So that's a major thing, it's a major problem that I see with non-hierarchical groups and activist movements. But in other ways, it's far more democratic. Not capital, lowercase d.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nona. I think that, you know, BLM is a really good example of this, because they literally changed the public conversation in the last 2 years on the criminal justice system, and you had like, you know, VP candidates talking openly on national television about race in the criminal justice system, which like for me was such a moment of clarity around how effective BLM had been. But then looking after the election, that there, you know, many BLM groups didn't do like a ton of down ballot organizing or, you know, get out the vote work. You know, some did, like Color of Change did a lot and whatever. But, you know, kind of seeing that kind of difference between doing this like public cultural work and then, as you say, like how that translates to the kind of electoral process, but also like this spirit of inclusiveness and that like we're all a community and we do it together. Like often I do think, you know, people get very focused on like, are we using all the right terminology? Are we including everyone properly? And that becomes so much of the focus, which is obviously important, but also may not be expedient in terms of like setting an agenda and making a game plan. So yeah.
Well, sometimes though that works out well. Like the March for Women's Lives wouldn't have been as successful if somebody hadn't stepped in and said,
yeah,
like, let's make this more diverse and
yep,
and whatever, and not call it the Million Women's March.
Thank God.
Yeah. You know, but on the other hand, the kind of, and you've said this a couple times now, but this sort of focus on identity as a driver of left-wing politics has especially in the primaries, but also since the election, been met with a pretty significant backlash on the left. And it's been sort of fascinating and disheartening to watch a lot of the conversations that are happening around what the future of both the Democratic Party is and the future of left-wing organizing and activism. And it seems like there are kind of two really kind of at each other, like at heads with each other ideas. And, you know, one is that the kind of more socialist position of class is what really underwrites everything, and that's what we need to be focusing on. And then the other one is the kind of more feminist, and obviously there are overlaps here, and I'm oversimplifying this greatly, but the sort of more traditionally feminist position, which is that race and gender and all of the other vectors upon which our identities are built, including class, influences the way that we move through the world and how inequities are distributed, and so identity matters also. And again, that's a vast oversimplification. But you know, I'm curious if both of you think that these rifts can be healed or bridged. What sort of has caused them? You know, how this kind of came and bubbled up, and what if there's a way to kind of move forward as one sort of cohesive left-wing movement, or if that's just not possible or even desirable. Big question. It's like 8 questions in that question.
Well, to me, it's really exposed the sexism and racism of the left in a way that I didn't think it was a generational problem, and I really didn't think that was like a problem of our generation. I knew it was a problem of like my parents' generation, but it's become really clear to me that those things still strongly exist within the left. So that doesn't answer your question. I'm sorry. Oh God, your question was, can they?
Yeah, I mean, can we heal these rifts? Do we even want to? And then what does sort of the future of the American left look like, or what should it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and this is all top of mind because Jill and I just worked on another book together about, feminism in Trump's America. And one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is kind of the role that, or like the ways that we can kind of be inclusive while still having a salient agenda, right? And I think a really good example of that is, the feminist movement having its kind of come to Jesus with the trans movement, and how to actually incorporate the voices of trans women. And what I always say is these are difficult conversations, and sometimes they're scary because you're like, oh, I made it this far, like we can't give up ground now. But actually, like, including trans voices only strengthens the movement because it forces you to really think about what the parameters of it are, what your priorities are, what the agenda is, and it forces you to think about how you think about gender and how you kind of prioritize it, or might have your own blind spots around kind of gender and trans identity. And so I do think there's this kind of, like, I think it's exciting that people are having the conversation about like what are the parameters of these movements, and I don't think we're gonna see eye to eye. Like I don't expect 2 people at the Women's March to be like, agree on the issue of Palestine. Like, I think that's ambitious, right? Like, I think that's really ambitious. But I do think we can come to some consensus around an agenda and say that, in order for us, like, one of the biggest frustrations for me actually has been, and with some of the more ardent Bernie supporters, my brother being one of them, so it's like really, really personal battle for me. Like, every trip home is like, is, this kind of reluctance to see that, like, having, even if they're not perfect, left-leaning candidates in big offices in the government actually help progressive agendas, like, at the local level, and kind of what that relationship is, and coming to some consensus around that. Like, I do think that's a more realistic short-term goal than saying, like, we're all gonna vote for Laverne Cox, which I want to see, but we may not see.
Great. So I'll open it up to audience questions, if anyone has any. Do we have mics in the audience, or can you just stand up and talk loud? Oh, good. Thank you. So, up here.
Hi, thank you. This was fantastic. I wanted to ask a question related to what Samita said earlier about, I think it seems like the insights of intersectional feminism are so key at this moment. And I think we saw that at the Women's March in a really incipient way. that an anti-racist politics is a feminist politics, that labor politics is a feminist politics, that the fight for sanctuary cities is a feminist politics, Black Lives Matter. But I think there's also a question that the question I have is, I think there's a fundamental question about whiteness that is a central question to feminism right now, to left politics in general. And in the same way that I think a truly feminist politics requires a new form of masculinity, which feels like your book is pointing to, right? Like a truly new feminist politics requires a new kind of masculinity, or men to reckon with new forms of masculinity. I think a truly feminist world also requires a new relationship to whiteness and a new relationship to straightness. And as a lot of scholars in political science discovered in this election, Jane Jun and other folks, that the majority of white women voted for Trump, and college-educated white women only by like 1 point, 51%. So clearly there is an issue here around that issue. And I guess I was curious about what you all think needs to happen between white feminists who are committed to anti-racism, who are committed to fighting anti-immigrant violence, committed to fighting against Islamophobia. What do the majority of white feminist women need to do in terms of having conversations with white women who voted for Trump? So I just was curious if you had thoughts about we've been talking about diversity and difference, but I think we're really talking about whiteness in a really critical way, and what it means for feminists to have a conversation about whiteness that's more explicit and more public.
Either of you interested in taking
I will let one of my white comrades answer this question.
I'll act as tribute. I mean, yes, agreed. There's I'm just gonna tout one of my fusion writers, Katie McDonough, who wrote an amazing piece about, sort of like a reported piece, but an essay about why white women voted for Trump. And it was basically deeply, like, steeped in self-preservation and kind of feeling like the tenets of white supremacy would be beneficial to them in a way that a Hillary Clinton / like diversity platform wouldn't be. And I think that's like kind of where it starts. I know I've seen a lot of articles about, oh yeah, talk to your white women who voted for Trump, but it's actually really, really difficult to talk about this white supremacy element because it's so subconscious and nobody wants to admit it. It's a calculus that female Trump supporters have made, where they don't necessarily agree with all of the bigotry, but they see that they'll be protected in some way by the way that it maintains the status quo. And it's the crux of that is really, really hard to just bring up in casual conversation, because what white women, at least I've had 2 conversations with white Trump supporters, female Trump supporters, and both of them are sort of like very, I don't think almost any of them are on the level of thinking it has anything to do with race. It's just really, really difficult to have these conversations. And I think some sort of cultural awareness on the level of Black Lives Matter, for instance, has to happen to connect white womanhood with the idea of white supremacy. Right now, I think the way people think of white supremacy is very male. They think of Richard Spencer, they think of Steve Bannon, they think of like Dylan Roof and people like that. So I guess the first step would be to make this idea of white womanhood, like sort of like fragile white womanhood, part of the conversation about white supremacy before we start having those on an individual level, because I feel like women would be completely blindsided if you start bringing up white supremacy and how that connects to them being a woman.
I'll add just a little bit, which
Sorry, that was a long answer.
I mean, but look, the reality of every feminist movement, at least in the United States and many abroad, is that women have also been on the forefront of opposing it, right? And in the U.S., it's been mostly white women who have been at the forefront of opposing women's rights to vote. And the argument then was, I love and trust my husband, and so he's going to vote on behalf of our family, and this is better for society. When feminists were trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, it was sort of a foregone conclusion until Phyllis Schlafly rallied her troops, who are mostly, Christian women in the U.S., who very successfully defeated that. So this is not a new dynamic. And to be totally honest, when I saw that 53% of white women voted for Trump, I was surprised that it was so low. White women had voted for Republican candidates in larger numbers in previous elections. So not that that's like heartening in any way, because it's obviously not. But there were at least some women who rejected Trump specifically. The reality is that, of course, like Nona was saying, white women benefit from patriarchy in a way that many women of color don't, right? Like part of the whole system is, you're both on a pedestal and also in a cage. And for white women, your reproduction is at least valued. Motherhood is considered important for you. You are considered fragile and, attractive, and you do reap all of these racial benefits that are also gendered. And that can be a complex thing for feminists to talk about, because something Samita's been saying is that we have this idea of like feminism is for like all women, and women is this category whose experiences are all the same. And obviously they're not. And, white women, by virtue of our race, benefit from sexist systems too, in certain ways, obviously not in every way. And that's just kind of a nuance to feminist work that I don't know that we figured out a good way to talk about. And I don't know that you want to come into a room of Trump supporters and say, like, hey, white ladies, if we get our way, like, you're not going to be at the top anymore, because that's not a great selling point. I think that the reality is that there's always going to be women who are anti-feminists in the US. Those women are going to be disproportionately white. And I'm sort of less interested, I guess, in convincing each of them individually that we are correct. And I'm more interested in winning the legislative and cultural battles and kind of relegating them to the sidelines, which is maybe not a very nice thing to say, but I think is probably a more realistic one. Other questions? Yeah. Sorry, not trying to make you run around.
A little two-part thing. May I chime in response to your brilliant question? I think what could help a lot is bringing to the forefront the social construction of race. When we talk about feminism, we talk a lot about the social construction of gender. I read a book last year by, two Black American sisters who are sociologists at Columbia called Racecraft. I recommend it to everybody. I've recommended it to my family, and it's radically changed how I view myself and this thing that we call race. And my question is, this is my second feminist event. My first one was yesterday. And
Welcome.
Thank you. And the person who posed the question prefaced it by prioritizing women, and the acronyms are growing, transgender and other specific identities. And I felt excluded, which is cool, exclude me, whatever. But can you be a feminist and not be anti-men? Can you be pro-men and pro-women? Do you have to be pro and con? What's the relationship between those two?
I love the feminist bloggers.
Okay, so can you be feminist and not anti-man? I don't know.
No.
Just kidding. It's like, I hate men. I hate men because I love them. I think that's it's connected to a lot of different things. I mean, I think feminism has this like really bad rap around it being about man-hating, or kind of the idea that equality of women is somehow reliant on the subjugation of men, which I think is one of the most troubling notions, because feminism really is about equality, right? It's so many things, and people will tell you different definitions and what it means to them, but at its core, it's about, women's kind of having access to basic human rights and equality in society. And so, I think it's a really important question for us to constantly be asking around, because there are a lot of bad things that bad men do, and sometimes it's easy to like slip into like, and that's men, and that's how men are, but that's ultimately I don't think most people feel that way, and I don't think most feminists feel that way, even if sometimes that's how it's translated. It's, often people kind of like working through how they like identify as feminist and what that means for them. So not only do I think it's possible, I actually think it's kind of a myth that feminists hate men. If anything, my experience has almost been, and I don't know if you guys have had this experience, like when I speak to young women often in college campuses, like the first question they ask is like, how do we engage the men on campus? Because they recognize the role that men play in kind of a lot of the like campus sexual assault or like these issues where we really need buy-in from men also. So I don't know, long-winded answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think feminism has done an excellent job at shifting roles and norms for women, right? Like, we're all in pants right now and don't have to wear makeup every day if we don't want to. And, all of us work in jobs that have been traditionally fairly male dominated. And so you have seen that kind of crossover, right, of like women moving into traditionally male spheres, which makes sense and is good and is a huge victory. What you haven't really seen is norms of masculinity and maleness being broken down the same way. So there are more ways to be female than ever before, but there's still kind of the same way to be a guy. And male identity still very much hinges on being a breadwinner and being somebody who supports your family and, working and labor. And there's, more space. Men spend more time with their kids than ever before. And, there is this kind of small movement. But men don't have nearly as much kind of space to explore their own identities, I think, as women have sort of carved out for ourselves in the past couple decades. I don't think that's necessarily the job of women to like figure that out. But for men, and I know this wasn't exactly your question, but I think for men who are looking to engage with feminism and are looking to engage in gender politics, I think that's a really ripe space for movement and a place where I think men could do a lot to both support kind of women and equality, but also, frankly, to make life better for themselves and to just have a little bit more fluidity and openness in how they and you live your lives. And I would bet that most feminists would be pretty happy and supportive of that.
One thing I want to add is what's making this conversation difficult nowadays is because this period of us trying to convince people that feminists don't hate men and that female equality is not a zero-sum game, we're also seeing sort of like a widespread economic shift that just happens to be hurting men worse. And it's not disconnected because the old system was based on men being breadwinners, and now that for a variety of economic and social and cultural reasons, that's not the case. But that's also, I mean, a lot of people have posited that that's sort of at the root of a lot of like Trump voters' rage, and that it's consciously or subconsciously having to do with feeling like women are usurping men. Mm-hmm. But really, like, that's kind of where like the Bernie voters come into play, honestly. Like they, like if they would just sort of connect those two and say, like, these economic policies not only will help poor people, but also will like lessen the like war of the sexes, then I think we'd be better off.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go to a next question in a second. But I mean, one thing that I think is so interesting about that kind of debate is that and with all the emphasis on like the, blue collar white man who voted for Trump, I mean, those same blue collar workers, despite breadwinning being an important kind of male identifier, are not going into the kind of traditionally female-dominated jobs that are now opening up, jobs in the healthcare field, jobs as care workers. And yes, I mean, part of that is that those jobs tend to pay less. They pay less because women have always done them, and women's labor is systematically devalued. But a lot of men won't do those jobs because they're also seen as feminine, right? And that's seen as demeaning and humiliating to take a woman's job, to be like a male nurse or a male caregiver. And the sort of downstream impacts of that are obviously devastating, both for an individual family's health and then for community health. And so, these issues obviously they impact men as well. And these kind of expectations impact individual men, and they impact our political system, and they feed into this kind of male rage that I think we really saw rear its head in this election. So, other questions?
Hi, I'm super happy to be here, especially talking about pleasure politics on a day like today where it moves like we're really moving towards a politics of punishment, especially on folks who've experienced gendered violence, who are sick and are ill. And I was really happy, Samita, that you brought up Nancy Pelosi, like really compromising and putting forth a politics of compromise on abortion rights, and like how we can reframe that as a politics of pleasure, and how not having access to abortion is a form of punishment for sexuality. So I'd love to hear from you about how we can use pleasure as a tool to push a progressive agenda and use it as like a form of resistance against these politics of punishment.
I'm gonna let Jill take that question. That's what her book's about.
Right. And what I had some help with researching. To me, yeah, I think that's sort of the fundamental issue that I write about in the book. The reality is a lot of these kind of intractable battles that we're fighting, I don't think we would be fighting them if we were operating from this baseline that happiness and pleasure for women are moral goods. So things like having sex for fun because it feels good. That is a human impulse, and it is a positive one, and it's a good one, and sex should feel good and be fun. Most of us are doing this already, right? Like sex is for sure the most popular recreational activity in the United States. But that's just, it's not how we talk about it or sort of culturally conceive of it, specifically on a political level. And, if we agreed sex should be good and fun, and, you should also be able to have sex that feels good and fun and not worry about having a child if you're not ready, or, contracting an STI that, is going to be expensive and annoying to deal with. If we came at it from that perspective, I don't think we'd be having these fights about access to birth control. I don't think we'd be having fights about abortion. I don't think we'd be having fights about abstinence-only education. A lot of the stuff that we spend a lot of time debating and discussing really is centered in this hostility to women doing things that feel good and are fun and are not purely sacrificial. The debates that we're having about women and work, I think if we had an agreement that work, if not, ideally, of course, work would be, fulfilling and everybody would love their job. But short of that work shouldn't make your life totally miserable. And also that being a parent should not be an act of full sacrifice, but can also be an act of pleasure and enjoyment. And that every parent has the right to have a full and fulfilling life. And that having a child doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sacrifice everything for that child, and that isn't or should not be the kind of goal of raising a small human. I think if we started with that viewpoint, we wouldn't be debating whether or not mothers and fathers should get time off of work when their children are small. That would be kind of a foregone conclusion, right? We wouldn't be having these conversations about whether or not like women can have it all. Like we would realize we're all full human beings who have complex and multifaceted lives, and we, it's not like these systems that we operate in just exist independent of us. Like we build them and create them and make laws and policies and decisions that shape them. And we've made choices in the US to make certain people's lives harder. So one of the studies that I cite in the book is that single mothers in the US are worse off by basically every measure than single mothers in every other country, every other developed country that is like our economic peer. And that is very much a choice. And the reason for that is not because single mothers in other countries make more money. It's not because single mothers in other countries are wealthier when they become single mothers. Single mothers sort of across, Western Europe and the US do tend to have the same kind of characteristics individually. It's almost all the social safety net and the social policies that these countries have that decide whether or not single mothers live like they do in the US, disproportionately in crushing poverty, or whether single mothers are able to, if not thrive, at least kind of survive above a certain baseline. So these are choices we're making to make life harder for much of our population. And I do think to your question, having a sort of pleasure politic at the center of this, to say the role of our government and of our institutions is not just to make sure we don't die. Although the vote today, I think, proved that that isn't even like the baseline anymore. That that shouldn't be the goal. The goal is how can these institutions and laws and policies actually create a landscape in which all of us are better able to pursue a life that feels useful and meaningful. Do you guys want to add anything to that?
Into it.
Okay. Any other questions? Tess? Glasses behind you.
Hi. I am wondering how you all personally combat fatigue. I feel like not that this is about me, but that I fluctuate between very angry and engaged, and usually after disappearing down the daily rabbit hole of whatever awful news is happening that day, wanting to retreat. So I'm wondering, as women who are so entrenched in these issues all the time, how you keep going, and also what you would say to people who feel discouraged, because there is a lot to be discouraged about at this point in time.
Something that's helped me since the election, and this might seem counterintuitive because a lot of my friends are political and a lot of them like to talk about these things on off hours, but I've actually really tried to have a better work-life balance, sort of like what you were you saying this in the green room, or were you saying it here? I don't remember, but but I try to really turn off work in a way that paradoxically I didn't when it was less important, so that I have the energy every day to deal with it in a finite way. Like I used to, so before the election I worked at TPM, which is a really intense political site on a really intense timetable, and it's a place that's really all-consuming, and it was just at the beginning of Trump's rise, but still a lot of terrible things were happening. Like, it was the height of, like, attention towards Black Lives Matter type shootings, and it was not good for my mental health. And then, and Fusion, first of all, Fusion has, like, a really good work-life balance culture, and I do believe that's a generational thing, because it's sort of like skewed towards younger people, and therefore I believe that there are certain workplaces that are run by young people who actually understand work-life balance. But it's always been a thing, like in activism and in sort of like leftist organizations, to have, like I was saying, like the morality of sacrifice. It's not just like a Christian thing. It's also often like a leftist thing, and it can really burn you out really badly. So what I've been doing is just going to work from 9:30 to 6:30, and like after 6:30, like try to do something fun and non-political, and like surround myself with people who aren't gonna like make me super agitated about those things.
Yeah, no, same. Because I feel like,
As someone who has no work-life balance, what do you think?
yeah, I was like, I'm tired. I want to sleep under this table right now. Yeah, I mean, like I feel we hang out all the time and we don't talk about politics like ever. I feel like
it's true,
actually,
but it's kind of on purpose.
Yeah.
It's like there's certain people that you are doing work parallel to you, and sometimes if you have something you really need to work on, like if you're writing a piece about something, or if you like really can't for the life of you like parse this thing out, like yes, of course you're going to talk to your peers, but like Samita and I make a point of talking about things that are not this all the time.
Yes, true. Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of kind of restorative. I'm a giant hippie, like I'm wearing a big crystal right now, but like I do a lot of kind of like restorative practice stuff that like kind of like a lot of reflective work, because I think it helps to really step back and just like, it's so easy to be fatigued right now. And it's not even like it's the political condition, but it's also the rate at which media comes to you now, and having to sift through like 17 different social media channels and text messages. And like, there are some days where I'm just like, this is not like normal. Like, this is not normal to like have this many people needing this many things from me at the exact same moment. and kind of like stepping back and not feeling like I have to like respond to every single person or that I have to engage every time someone wants to talk to me about it. My family in particular really wants to talk to me about politics, and I'm always like, that's my job. Like I actually don't want to do it, and I don't want to talk about it. And sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't. But so I do think facilitate like having friendships and relationships in your life where you can kind of be silly and be more focused on pleasure, eating a good meal or having a great glass of wine together, or even like taking a yoga class, or something that just gets you out of the day to day and the kind of difficulties that that we're seeing in the news, or even like watching Handmaid's Tale didn't feel like relaxing. Like I was like, it's like not relaxing.
I was saying, I was actually feeling kind of relaxed by it, because I was like, I honestly like don't see this God stuff nearly as much anymore. It's like kind of nice, but also maybe scary.
Yeah. No. So yeah, and I would say it's an ongoing thing, because I also think like this isn't normal. Like we are going to be fatigued right now. That's part of the problem. And so, creating those spaces so you can re-energize yourself so you can get plugged back in, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just drink a lot of wine has been my solution. It's not working very well. But for me, like shutting off the phone sometimes. That's not true. I don't shut it off, but I at least stick it in my purse and don't look at it for some extended period of time, which is a real challenge, especially like, we all work in media, so we're coming from a perspective of people that are always connected, but I would bet that many people, at least in this room, are not folks who cover politics and domestic politics day in and day out. And I can imagine that, especially if your job is not in this universe, that the amount of like your leisure time that feels like it's sucked up by just going down these rabbit holes is probably significant. That like you go on your lunch break at work and you check your phone and there's the New York Times alert that like sends your heart palpitating. And I don't know what the answer is. Like I think all of, like Samita said, all of us are going to be fatigued. This is a stressful and shitty and bad time. And I think it's, on the one hand, okay to say, like, I'm going to feel stressed out and shitty and bad sometimes, and I'm going to over-fatigue myself, and I'm going to counter that by, like, eating a bowl of pasta and drinking wine and then feeling worse about my life. And that's, like, an okay, maybe not the healthiest, but an okay and normal reaction. The one thing I've at least tried to do is, when I'm going to get dinner with my, like, best friend or my partner, putting the phone away and not checking the Times alert and not looking at every single time it buzzes, and having a conversation that like maybe it touches on politics, but that it's totally okay for one of us to say like, I can't have this conversation right now. Like I cannot talk about Nancy Pelosi and her stupid abortion comments while I'm like eating my ramen. That just has to be put to the side. And not feeling guilty like you're somehow falling down on the feminist movement or lefty politics or other women by like taking a break and just refusing to engage for a little while.
Can I ask you a question, Jill, that I thought you were about to talk about, but you didn't? That you actually don't live in this country right now. Jill lives in Nairobi and has throughout this whole entire process, and I'm wondering how that's affected you. Is it less or more stressful to be so far away from what's going on?
It's like 95% of the time less stressful. I mean, it's nice. So the time difference is huge. Like I'm 7 hours ahead. So I wake up in the morning and I like spend an hour or two responding to emails, and then nobody bugs me for the rest of my work day. And Twitter is really quiet, and like no one's doing anything stupid. And I can just like I wake up and look at all the shocking, idiotic things that happened the night before, and stress out about it over my morning coffee. But for the most part, I have like a very quiet and nice and super productive work day, because it's not, this stuff isn't kind of flying at me constantly. My phone isn't constantly buzzing, and then it hits 4 p.m., which is like 9 a.m. US time, and everything starts to kind of go to hell immediately. But it's been really nice, and I think it has, I also talk to people during the day, not all of whom are American, and not all of whom are totally immersed in like the day-to-day of US politics, which feels like a huge relief. That said, the one time I really wished I was here was the day after the election. Like it was just so devastating. And, I went to like the coffee shop and, remembered walking in and everybody was just going about their day. Like everything was normal. And of course, it was for like everyone in the whole rest of the world. But as an American, it was kind of like nothing is normal. Like everything just got screwed up. Everything just went to hell. And so that was hard, not being in like a community in a city like New York where everyone is walking around like someone had just died. So,
I think we have time for one more question.
One more question.
Hi. So my question is kind of related to a bunch of different things, but I'm also a journalist and consider myself an activist, and so I'm like plugged in all the time, and I post a lot of statuses where I'm very angry. And so I posted something recently that was like about men and how they were doing something terrible again, and this guy messaged me and was like, hey, I just wanted to let you know that like it's not always like every one of us. Like there are progressive men out there, and like when you say that, it alienates people who are on the fence. And like I just want the movement to grow too, and so I think you should be careful with your language. And so I explained to him, and I was like, like since the election, like I just don't give a shit about that. Like for lack of a better word, I just don't care. But I was also like, I kind of see his point, because I do think we can't just label people like all men are doing this. But it's especially hard for me because like I'm a sexual assault survivor, and so I do kind of think that like how many times do you have to qualify it when you're like men, cis het white men who like are mostly woke, who understand consent? Like how many qualifiers do I have to put on it before it's finally like I'm addressing the group that is committing this like crime or whatever? So I'm just wondering like how, like if you have advice for like navigating that or like dealing with it, because I feel like I spend a lot of emotional labor like trying to make sure I'm like not offending some person's feelings who actually is progressive and like wants to be included in this message.
Super easy. Everything you say, just hashtag it, not all men. Problem solved.
Or just like send them an article about that explains not all men. I come up against this problem all the time. I recently wrote something that was like I don't know what it was, but it really just got like the not all men people like out in droves, and because actually it was a piece that ended with somebody saying every single man grows up in a culture that's like steeped in misogyny, and there's going to be some osmosis, and what you have to do is just determine how much. And a lot of people got really upset about that, like in the same manner as like your person. But I think that sort of like takes the onus off of like whether an individual is a bad person or a weak person or a stupid person, and just says, look, you live in this culture. It's impossible for you to not have absorbed some of this stuff, and all you have to do is make sure that it's as little as possible. And when you catch yourself doing that, you should recognize it. Just like every white person is steeped in like racism, and when you catch yourself being racist, you have to say like, that was me being racist. That's like literally what I tell dudes. I'm like, there are moments when I'm like telling myself that I'm being racist, and I just have to be like, shit. And it's not necessarily commenting on how good of a person you are so much as the society that you live in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I worry about a progressive condition where people are unable to continue the conversation the moment their feelings get hurt. Because, like, my feelings get hurt constantly. Like, I'm very sensitive, and, and I'm like, was that personal? Was that not personal? Like, this is an ongoing conversation. Like, I'm like, they didn't come to my party. They must hate me. It's personal. Like it's, there's like so many moments of that. And I think like we kind of need sometimes like to be courageous in those moments and just say like, you know what, I'm going to say something that might actually hurt your feelings. And kind of, it's not my responsibility to manage your feelings on it. And that's not to say you shouldn't hold yourself accountable to not be generalizing and to be really authentic and rigorous in the politics you're expressing. But like sometimes, and I think especially as women, like we are so socialized to say things that make people feel comfortable that we almost, will couch the things we believe in. I see myself doing it all the time because I'm like, I don't want to offend this person. And so to, in those moments, be like, okay, your feelings are hurt. Like, now what? What comes after that? And if that's the end of the conversation, like, you gotta be like, okay, does this person actually want to know about this? Like, do they want to learn more about, yes, all men or not all men?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's an important question, and I think that there's something of a divide between, are you doing work as an activist who's trying to kind of change people's minds and change a culture, or, which is not really work that I do, or do you consider yourself, are you trying to be more of kind of a cultural critic and commentator, or are you trying to be a journalist? I mean, these are all kind of different roles, right? And they necessitate a different set of values and a different way that you then engage with your audience. So, yeah, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time in my work worrying about, like, the not all men folks. And I tend to not do a whole lot of sort of qualification about, like, not every, white Trump voter is, like, racist or there's one out there that's not. I don't spend a lot of time doing that.
Statistically disproven.
Right. But at the same time, when I watch a lot of the discourse, I think especially within the feminist movement, I am a little bit concerned about how effective we're going to be if a lot of our fallbacks are kind of cliched like responses. Like, when somebody says something you don't like and the response is check your privilege. Like, no one has ever heard that and said, oh, like, I'm totally chastened. Like, I will check my privilege, and I realize that I am privileged, and, like, you are correct, and I am wrong. Which doesn't mean that that's not, a sort of a meaningful thing to say, and it doesn't mean it's not cathartic to say it to someone. But if what you're actually trying to do is get somebody to consider their role in a greater ecosystem of inequality, that's not the best way to do that. It's a good way to feel good. And feeling good is underrated, so I'm not saying that there's like never space to launch that one at somebody. But if what you're trying to do is, change people's minds or shift their perspectives, I do think a bit more sort of generosity in the way that we talk to each other is warranted within the feminist movement. I'm not one of these people that's like, go to Alabama and talk to a white Trump supporter and like if you're just nice enough he'll come to your side. I don't think that works. But I do worry that feminists have gotten more hung up on being righteous than, and I include myself in this, certainly. I've been a little bit more concerned with being righteous and feeling like we're right, and with these kind of like gotcha lines that we throw at people, which I do again like all the time, so I'm the first perpetrator of this, then actually being very effective at communicating what it is that we want and what needs to change and how that could be beneficial for everyone. So I mean, it's something I'm thinking about a lot because I'm crap at it.
Can I just say one thing, though? It really depends on who's asking you to expend that emotional labor. If it's like some total fucking rando, you have no obligation to talk to them. It depends on whether or not you care about that person and whether or not you're invested in that person. And if you're not, you just can feel free to completely ignore them, or else you'll go insane.
Yeah, no, I don't respond with generosity to like every jerk on Twitter.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I mean, like within like leftist feminist movements, right? So people that are kind of already natural allies, and you're not necessarily talking about like how do I convince Jim in at whiteman65 on Twitter to like come and see the feminist light. Like I don't think you're getting there, and it's a massive waste of time. But if people that are kind of natural allies, like it sounds like this guy, despite being a bit obnoxious, and I probably would have ignored that message honestly, but people that should be your natural allies or could be, or people that you at least trust enough to engage with, I don't know that we're doing ourselves a lot of favors by kind of falling back on like, you're privileged and therefore like that was a stupid question and next. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say the bar for entry on Twitter is real low. Like you just need to get to the internet. Just remember that.
All right. Well, thank you guys all for coming tonight. And thank you especially to Nona and Smita, who are brilliant and amazing, and to the Strand for hosting us. It was a lovely event. So I think we'll hang out up here for a few minutes if folks want to come and chat, but enjoy the rest of your evening.